we've seen it in our...
I'm Oya.
I'm Josa.
And I'm Mika.
We are Wise Owl, a group of communicators for social change. In the course of our work, people have approached us having had a negative experience with communication.
Kasi naman, kalatang fake news, kaliwat kanan nagsisiraan. Ang bilis mag-shift ng trends. Kakagawa mo pa lang, laos na.
What more if you're an advocate or communicating a cause? Saan ka lulugar? Paano ka makikipagsabayan? The thing is, we've seen it in our practice. Communication is powerful.
If only we took the time to talk about it.
And that's why we're doing this podcast.
Here at Give A Hoot, we will sit down and talk to strategists, advocates, academics, creatives, and others who can talk about how we can use communication in creating positive change.
Let's have more of these conversations that make us really think about issues that make an impact.
Give a hoot with us.
Subscribe to Anchor, Spotify, and soon your favorite podcasting platforms.
Give A Hoot is powered by PumaPodcast.
Hello, hi, everyone here. We have people coming in. We have around 69 participants now. So welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Miko Ortega. I will be one of your hosts today. With me are my co-hosts Oya Ariola and Jozanada. We are all co-founders and of Wise Owl and also co-hosts of the podcast called Give A Hoot. Welcome to our first ever webinar called Coping with COVID, How Do We Spread Hope? This event is co-presented with JustLabs, PumaPodcast, and OMCT. JustLabs is a center for creativity in the social change field, designing tools and solutions to help advocates make an impact on societies. PumaPodcast is the Philippines' first podcast network, sharing joy, power, and the value there is in listening. They're a first mover in podcasting in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. OMCT is the main global coalition of civil society organizations fighting for a world free of torture. They work for the protection of human rights defenders around the world. This webinar is also a continuation of Give A Hoot podcast episodes about hope-based communications in the time of COVID-19. Thanks to the positive response we got from our community, all co-presenters wanted to go ahead and deepen the conversation. That's why we're all here today. But before we begin, we would like to note that only hosts, panelists, and discussants will have audio and video input during this webinar. All attendees will be on automatic mute to help avoid possible disruptions. We will try to stick to 90-minute stops for this session. This includes the talks of our three panelists, as well as reactions and questions from our guest discussants. Please note that this session will be recorded, the video will be uploaded online, and a special podcast episode will be produced. Now, on to our panel. Allow me to call on my co-host, Oya Ariola. Oya?
Hello, everybody. Yes, to start our discussion off, we have with us Thomas Coombes. Thomas is a communication strategist who has worked with organizations like Amnesty International and Transparency International. Thomas is the co-founder of the organization called Hope-Based Communications and is an associate of JustLabs. Thomas was our special guest in the podcast episode Mika mentioned earlier and is gracious enough to join us from Germany today. Thank you, Thomas. Please take it away.
Thanks, Oya, and thanks everyone for joining. It's a great pleasure to be connected to you all from the other side of the world. Even if we're locked in our living rooms and bedrooms, we can still be connected. So I want to talk to you about hope-based communications, which is an idea that I came across after working in human rights communications for several years. And my approach used to be sort of very negative, in which my sort of nature, being Irish, is to be quite cynical. And I spent most of my work sort of naming and shaming governments who committed human rights abuses. But I found that actually I realized the goal of my work, I wanted to create empathy for people who are suffering. And I realized that my work wasn't achieving that. And so I started trying to look at neuroscience and psychology to see how I can better understand people and do better at changing their behavior. And above all, the most important thing that I learned is, all of us as human beings, we never reason purely rationally. We always make our decisions emotionally as well as rationally. Even if you're a scientist or an expert, subconsciously our emotions are always at play. And so there are two really big thinkers from the United States who sort of drive this approach. One is on the Republican side, Frank Luntz, who wrote a book with the subtitle, "It's not what you say, it's what people hear." And then I realized that, a lot of the time we communicate with the things we think make sense, but we don't always check, actually, does our audience understand what we're saying the same way? And then really my biggest inspiration is a communicator from the United States called Anat Shenker-Osorio. And she has a brilliant saying, which is, it's not about saying what's popular, it's about making popular what needs to be said. And really that spoke to my burning passion, which is how do I make people care about human rights? And so I had this sudden realization, and I changed the way I do my work, which is actually what people want from a human rights organization is not to tell them that things are going wrong. That's part of our work. But above all, what they need us is to show how things can get better. And so that's what hope is. Hope is not actually about being happy or positive and ignoring all the bad things that are happening. Hope is actually about the belief that tomorrow can be better, but it requires action. It involves a certain vulnerability, taking a risk, and actually, going out and saying we believe in better. And there is an expression at the moment, around the coronavirus, which is we have to build back better. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can apply hope-based communications in this time of Corona. And actually, not only do we need hope just for ourselves, but actually hope is really important politically. And you hear a lot of voices already starting to boldly articulate new visions of how the world could look. But if we don't tie those visions to a story that really relates to people, there is a danger that the fear, the grief, the anxiety, the trauma that we're all going through that will be left behind takes us in the wrong direction, as it has in the past. And a lot of the times, sometimes in NGO work and in progressive communications, we're really focused on the facts and the policies, but we forget to check how are people feeling right now? And will their emotions be a barrier to hearing what we have to say? And I'll talk a little bit about that now. The biggest challenge for me, though, the starting point, why we need to look at what we call narrative, which is what is the basic stories that people use to understand the events around them. It's like a framework for interpreting events we see. We often focus in NGOs or in human rights on reacting to problems and also reacting against things. So we really articulate what we stand for in terms of the things we're against. We're against torture, we're against domestic violence, we want a world without executions, say we don't like austerity, but we actually don't spend as much time working on talking about what we are for. What would we like to see instead, and actually making the case for those things. So I'm going to talk about basically 3 simple steps that all of us can use to tell a story that helps us through the pandemic, but also builds support for a better world after it. And that's based on work that JustLabs have done with the Fund for Global Human Rights, looking at how do we respond to populist narratives that create division and turn people away from each other. And so the basic 3 points is about moving away from crisis to community, but having collective solutions, not individual ones, and having a strong vision for the future. So the first one is like, we really need to try, and it's really hard, but not use the word crisis. Because populist authoritarian leaders thrive in a crisis. And when people are afraid, when they're uncertain, they turn to strong leaders, right, who promise them a false sense of safety. So crisis feeds populism. One of the biggest challenges we're seeing around the world is that authoritarian leaders use this moment to grab more power. And so if we call this a crisis, there's this expression, this sort of common sense expression, that drastic times call for drastic measures. So the more we feed this sense of a world out of control, the more people are going to be ready to say, okay, let that leader take more power. I'm going to come back to how we should respond instead. But first, I want to emphasize this point of the challenge for us here is how do we help people feel hope, affirmation, and also pride at the way our communities are responding to this moment, to replace that sense of anxiety and fear that can turn us away from each other. How do we empower people who are living in this difficult moment of lockdown? I think the crucial things we want to look at are, how do we give people a sense of agency and a sense of belonging? And that's where community and collective action comes in. So looking here at the neuroscience, there's this expression called mortality salience. And it basically means the more we're reminded of death, the fact that we can die, we're vulnerable human beings, we're mortal, that actually, research has shown it triggers conservative policy positions. It makes us more likely to support, say, not helping refugees. It's because when we're reminded of our death, we seek meaning in life. And often if we're on the sort of human rights side or not coming along and helping people with that, a leader who comes and says we're a nationalist or dividing people by religions, people are looking for that identity. And so that's where it becomes really dangerous, that people will turn against each other. So psychologists say that one instinct is to have that division when you face a threat, but there are other instincts we can try and encourage, which is, so for example, it's called tend and befriend, which means, again, looking to help people. So to sum up that one point, it's instead of talking about crisis, let's call this a moment that we're living through together. Just a great example of that, in Wuhan, right at the beginning, people would say to each other an expression that meant don't give up. And in Italy, children are writing an expression in Italian that meant everything will be all right on walls and streets. So what we need, obviously, to highlight the things going wrong and show how to make them better, but we also need a certain sense of confidence that we do know how to make things better, and that if we do make the right decisions, things will be okay. That brings us to that second shift, which is focusing on the collective action, not on the individual. So just on a really practical level, if you tell people, don't go out, you might get sick, we found that wasn't actually as effective as saying, stay home, save lives. So it's just a simple shift to give people agency and actually say, this is about you taking action. And there was this sense of we're all staying home together in order to take care of the people who are most at risk. This comes again, a very simple insight, which is our instinct is often to highlight the suffering of certain groups of people. But there's a risk that if we talk about the suffering of a different group of people, our audience starts to see there's us and them. And so we need to sort of try and change that framing to, instead of it being separate groups of people, that this is about us taking care of each other. And we can do that by focusing on the stories of care and solidarity that we're already seeing in our communities. For example, here in Berlin, about 1 million refugees arrived over the last couple of years, and there are some really heartwarming stories of, say, a Syrian refugee whose restaurant is closed down, and they've started cooking food for people working in supermarkets. And often the media wants to tell the stories of division, but a lot of the stories that show how we want the world to be are already happening, and we have to put the spotlight on those stories as well. And so that's that final shift is, how do we confidently start telling the story of those things that are happening today that show how the world can be in future? So in the work of JustLabs, we've been calling on people to put the human in human rights, that human rights is not just about abuses taking place, it's also about how humans should treat each other. So we're challenging people to start, if you want to sort of talk about all the problems that are going wrong and your fears for the future, why not try and shift your sentence and say, in future, here's how things should be. So if you're worried about, say, invasive technology and surveillance, say, well, in the future, we could have an internet that, say, works for us. I think the biggest shift that we need to try and make here is our basic worldview of how the world works. And I'll end on this point, which is there's been this idea that strength comes from military power, from security. But actually what we're seeing in our society is that strength comes from our ability to care for each other. And you can see probably the most effective response to the crisis has been from Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. And so what we need to do is really start to reinforce that actually what strong leadership looks like is being able to care for each other. And that's the message we can all start promoting with the stories we tell. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to continuing the discussion with you.
Thank you for that, Thomas. Our next panelist is an award-winning journalist and the CEO of PumaPodcast, Roby Alampay. He is an anchor presenter on 2 nightly programs on Signal TV's all-news cable channel One News. Until recently, he was the editor-in-chief of the Philippines' oldest and leading business news provider, Business World. As a backstory, last year, it was Roby who had this crazy idea of starting a podcast about communication and social change. We know we wouldn't be here today without Roby's vision, so thank you for that, Roby. Roby will now talk about media's responsibility in promoting human rights in the time of COVID-19. Let me give you Roby Alampay.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Let me start off by saying Oya, you're giving me too much credit. Give A Hoot is a wonderful project, but if I remember correctly, it was Mika and you who really said that we have this agency, this communications agency that really focuses on giving platform and power to people who are advocating for particular causes, and that really was what got to me. And it was also convenient because I think it had something to do with our own vision for PumaPodcast, in that we feel that the podcasting platform lends itself to, as one of our more famous podcasters, Randy David, said, the unhurried conversation, more thoughtful discussions, partly because it's a function of not being able to compete on the level of breaking news, on all of this frenetic pace of information that wouldn't even allow you to breathe, much less think. And we thought that we could turn that into an advantage. And therefore, precisely podcasting and the project that we've embarked on in this kind of conversation is precisely the kind of thing that we need more of. That said, I think when you start up a podcasting company, it goes, I would like to think, into how I am. It's something that I think is important for people to appreciate. Notwithstanding the fact that I am a journalist, I do consider myself an optimist. And I do consider myself, I understand conceptually when you say hope-based communications, when Thomas says hope-based communications, I understand, I think, at core and at heart what that means. I'd like to think that our missions and our values there are aligned. But as a journalist, it does make the eyebrows go up. Hope, it's not necessarily what, I don't know if it's old school, but it's not necessarily what I was brought up to think. That journalism is about providing hope. Not necessarily. I have always thought of journalism as agnostic. I've always thought of journalism and news and independent media as something that the most optimistic side of it is just it trusts the people. It trusts the crowd. It trusts that when people are fully informed for both what can be perceived as skeptical or even overly skeptical or overly cynical, but at the same time are given the information that allows them to think critically and even be hopeful, that they can make that distinction on their own and they can make their decisions on their own. So I start with that. I'm an optimist. At the same time, I'm a journalist. I'm glad that Thomas brought up the word empathy because it quickly reassured me and gave me pause to think, okay, yes, I think that's where we can start. Not so much with a mission to provide hope, but rather to start with empathy. I think when you speak of moment, Thomas, I think there's something convenient about the current moment, in that whether or not you believe in hope-based communications, and you think whether or not the important thing for you is just understanding the pulse of the people and empathizing with them, not necessarily framing it as hope, doesn't matter, because the moment right now, my sense of it as a journalist, as an editor, is that people are looking for hope. It's not a cause that I'm pushing. It's not a particular advocacy, But purely editorially, I feel that people are looking for stories of hope, whether they call it hope, or stories of looking forward, looking up. At its most base, I think the stories that people are looking for are, it's still about health and safety, but I also think that people are looking for reasons and reassurances and reminders on how to move forward, how to pick themselves up, how to get up again, and how to walk again. So I think there's a way of moving forward on that topic. And then you throw in the final twist. You gave me the topic of hope, in particular for human rights in the Philippines. And again, it throws you for a loop. How can a journalist talk about hope for human rights in the Philippines at this particular moment? It's ironic on very many levels, and it keeps turning on very many levels. One ironic thing is we know that this crisis, and it is a crisis, speaking as a journalist, but this crisis, this moment, was in fact aggravated by the lack of human rights in China. It was in fact aggravated from the very start by an absence of free expression and a lack of press freedom. And we know also that FOI, freedom of information, press freedom, free expression, freedom of opinion, our ability to provide commentary, is also the things that will help to provide solutions and get us out of this mess. And then I think it's ironic, as I said, to look at it that way, because just in this past week, we have been given proofs of and evidence of how concretely that is true. Not necessarily on the level of solving COVID or defeating COVID, but all the other social and economic and political and social problems confronted that we now confront. In the past week, what has the Philippines experienced? Because of free expression, because of press freedom, because of social media, OFWs were overnight able to overturn an adjustment in their fees, something that people felt very unjust, very arbitrary. But overnight, because of the social movement, that was defeated. If the news that's coming out right at this hour is true, press freedom, free expression, and free commentary on social media platforms and public outrage is going to result in some level of police accountability. It was the outrage of people yesterday that really shouted down what people perceive as outright lies from a high-ranking police officials. And now it seems, according to Malacanang, there will be an official investigation looking at specific and probable sanctions against these high-ranking police officials. So you have these evidence that free expression, press freedom, human rights in general, empowers us and allows us to find, as you said, our own common understanding of what can get us out of this mess collectively and as a community. I'll end with this note. What's ironic, I think, and what's the challenge for us in terms of hope-based communications, particularly for human rights, what's ironic is that we have proven time and again the value of human rights when it comes to various advocacies, whether it's agriculture or putting food on the table or keeping prices in check or demanding accountability of our people or demanding accountability and transparency in the distribution of social amelioration funds on the level of barangay officials, right? But when it comes to human rights, advocating for the sake of human rights, that is where there is a disconnect. People will appreciate human rights, press freedom, their ability to provide commentary when it comes to the very concrete things that affect their lives. And yet human rights for human rights in its own sake, for its own sake, remains a very nebulous topic. That, I think, is where I will round out to hope-based communications, hopefully, helping us to bring us to a better normal and seizing this moment and our examples to say that in the better normal that we're working towards, human rights itself, let's not forget what human rights did for us during this moment, during this crisis, it did allow us to fight for transparency. It allowed us to fight for the rule of law. It allowed us to fight for prices, for taxes, and many, many things that kept us alive. May we move forward to a better normal when human rights, for the sake of human rights, will also then be aided by all of these examples, and we can be more concrete in empathizing with people, and in people empathizing and understanding the value of human rights.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Roby. Now for our last panelist, we actually invited Mayor Krisel Lagman-Luistro, the Chief Executive of Tabaco City, Albay, to tell us her own experience as a local leader in doing crisis communication in the time of COVID-19. Unfortunately, Typhoon Signal number 3 has just been declared over the Bicol region, so she must attend to her constituents first, and rightly so. But she has kindly recorded her presentation, which we will play for you now. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Krisel Lagman-Luistro.
Good afternoon. Hi to Oya, Mika, and Chosa, and all the speakers in this webinar. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Shelo Krisel Lagman-Luistro, the Mayor of Tabaco City. Tabaco City is where the Mayon volcano is. It is in the southern part of Luzon, facing the Pacific Ocean, in the province of Albay. We are taping this earlier than the webinar session because we're now under signal number 3 and preparing for the onslaught of Typhoon Ambo. Our evacuation started at noon. Everything is quite peaceful, and yet deep inside, of course, still chaotic because we are still under the COVID challenge. Nevertheless, I think this webinar is very important because it talks about a very, very essential thing that springs in the heart of most of us. It has been said by Alexander Pope that hope springs eternal in the human heart. And hope in the time of COVID, I think, is the best medicine. We have to have hope, not fear, not anger, not anxiety, but hope. So what is the role of local governments in spreading hope during this very challenging time? Let me just share to you what Tabaco City has done. And I think the biggest challenge for me as the mayor of Tabaco City is actually how can I package the information about a virus that has been unheard of. It only came out late last year in December. Not much is known about it, and it is invisible. How can I warn the people about it without sowing too much fear that would immobilize them, but actually inspire them to become part of the solution rather than the problem? And so the first thing I did was to get to know more about the virus and how I can package the information so that people in my locality would not only understand it, but know that they too can do something. They can actually do something to prevent the spread of this virus. So we had several meetings with barangay officials, city leaders, department heads, so that we can come up with a communication plan that would really hit home, make people understand that the virus is, yes, invisible, but the symptoms are very visible. And the symptoms are simple. It's coughing, it's sneezing, it's sore throat, sometimes it's diarrhea, difficulty breathing, fever. They're very visible, tangible symptoms. And then what do you do when you have those symptoms? So there should be a step-by-step process of reporting and then trusting the health workers, in this case, the BERT, which is not just health workers, but also community leaders, and then sending you to the right facility for isolation, for testing, and then sending you back to your communities and families after you have tested negative. So communication is key. Communication is vital so that people will cooperate. Early on, we started using social media, particularly Facebook, our page. We also set up a new page for COVID-related concerns so that there will be two-way communication between government and the people. It has been very effective to elicit comments, criticisms, both constructive and not too constructive. But at least we knew where people were and we can respond to their concerns and to their needs. An example would be this slide here, the COVID information. It's a COVID daily tracker that tells us about the confirmed cases, the total PUMs and PUIs, both the suspect and probable, the number of patients that have recovered, and the total number of deaths. It's easier to announce good news. Bad news is the one that's really very difficult to present to people. When we registered our first positive case in Tabaco, it was very difficult to announce to the public about this. But for us to be transparent, know where the community is, not necessarily the identity of the positive individual, that would help us in contact tracing. This has been a very effective tool to also make people part of tracking where we are in this fight against COVID. Another would be reporting to the people about our relief operations. They really want to know, tama ba ang na-receive namin? Did we really get 5 kilos of rice, 3 kilos of rice, or 2 kilos of rice? So with this quite colorful infographics, we were able to present to the people what was already given by government. And some of them were also in coordination with other government agencies like the Office of the Congressman or the Office of the Governor. Another slide would show how we appreciate our private donors. Very early on, a lot of families, companies, even farmers and fishermen would come forward and bring their donations for our frontliners. Which means that they really appreciate the work of the frontliners and they want to be part of the team that assists people. One of our posts that garnered more than 10,000 likes was the post on Butchoy. Butchoy is a deaf mute and he is a pajak or pedicab driver. He returned the 5,000 peso SAP allocation because he has already received one from another barangay. It's a classic example of double entry. He was registered in one barangay but was found to be living during this time in another barangay, and so he was counted twice. Butchoy has 5 children, very poor, no pajak, is operating now in Tabaco City. He badly needs that 5,000 pesos. But he came forward and returned it. And it just generated so much positive likes, positivity and likes, that many others followed suit. Those who were given dole allocations returned their SAP allocation when they found out that they would be receiving SAP from dole. So what I'm saying is that people look forward to good stories. People want hope in this time. Now, contrary to the notion that bad news, attracts attention, I think good news also attracts so much attention and inspires people to also do good things. So, telling the story of Butchoy has created a domino effect of positive behavior here in Tabaco City. The last slide that I would like to share with you is the social distancing hearts. I did not post anything about this, but the Radio Veritas posted it in their page, and they just appreciated so much the fact that we have used hearts. Tabaco is the city of love, to promote social distancing. The concept actually is follow me, follow my heart. It tells about respect, I respect you. I don't want you to be infected. And I love myself too, so that I will not be too close to you to be infected. Social distancing would be part of the new normal. And this is our personal commitment to take personal responsibility to stop the spread of the COVID virus. These are just simple examples from Tabaco City. I know the other local government units have lots to share. Thank you so much for giving us time, Tabaco City, a chance to also share with you what we have done so far. So much has to be done. Let us continue communicating hope, exporting hope, and not fear.
Thank you so much for that, Mayor Krisel. Now for our discussion, I'll hand this off to Mika. Mika?
Thank you, Oya. Okay, so to help structure our discussion, we have 4 guest discussants. Each of our discussants will be given the floor to react or to ask questions from our 2 panelists. Our 4 discussants are, first, artist and activist May Paner from JustLabs TG. You may know her as Wanna Change. May also happens to be our very first guest at Give A Hoot podcast, where we talked about the social movement she co-founded called #BabayAko. They were named as one of Time Magazine's 2018 most influential people on the internet. We also have Veronica Uy. She is currently the head of communications for the office of Senator Francis Kiko Pangilinan. Veronica is a former journalist, and small world note, she used to work as a writer/editor with Roby Alampay and some of the PumaPodcast crew in their past lives. Also joining us today is human rights specialist Edna Aquino. She used to work for Amnesty International in the UK. Edna has 4 decades of experience in human rights advocacy. She is also a co-founder of #BabayAko with May Paner. Last but not least, we have Michelle Pascual. She is currently the Behavior Change Communication Specialist for RARE, which is the world's largest organization and leading organization for behavior change for conservation. Oya, Jose, and I worked with Michelle back when we were all in advertising and PR. Michelle has led and advised behavior change communication campaigns for public health, biodiversity conservation, and human rights. We're so very grateful that we have all 4 discussants here today. We will start with May Paner. May?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, no? And hope-based communication is really something that I would really like to personally do in my own advocacy. But, I have my buts. I have been lucky to be part of the JustLabs group, where I have already heard Thomas speak on hope-based communications. And even then, I had so many questions in my head, like, for example, in the Philippines, where we have for our president, so many things, and even today it is happening. See how arrests are
May?
and something.
May?
Sorry?
Can you hear me? Yes. Your line is a little choppy lang.
Yes, I can. Oh, it's choppy.
Yeah.
Speak slower. What should
Yeah.
I do?
You can proceed. You can try. Can you proceed?
Okay. So anyway, what's happening now, and now the COVID situation, I'd really like positive things that I need to communicate about, that I am not sure if being hopeful is what I need to do all the time. I think I need to be very critical. I think a critical mind is very important to have at this time. And I don't think there is a one size fits all in this case. I think there are situations where you can really be very hopeful and positive, but there will be situations where you really
Hello. May? I think we're losing May.
need to
May? Yeah.
Are you losing me?
Yeah, we're losing you a little bit. Yeah, we're losing you a little bit. We lost you somewhere when you were talking about there are situations. So there's no one size fits all, but there are situations when. Okay. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if the connection is very good, but we can actually throw that question already to Thomas. Maybe your reaction about maybe we still, how do you balance that? How do you balance still being critical and that being a need, because we need to be critical, with hope-based communication? So maybe we can go to Thomas and Thomas can react to it.
Sure. Yeah, hi May, great speaking again. I think the key thing is that point I mentioned before, that to see hope less as optimism and more as a determination to make things better, because on its own, our sort of anger at the way things are can end up being exhausting. And there is a danger, what we've learned from neuroscience is that if you only show people the problem, they start to accept it as their new reference point. And we also need to show people how things could be instead. So, even if you find the idea of hope hard to process right now, the idea of hope-based comms in practice involves making 5 shifts. And one of those key shifts is, don't just talk about the problem, talk about the solution. And don't just talk about what we're against, talk about what we are for. And so, for example, if you have a leader who doesn't represent your values right now, one thing we've learned is that, say, if there's a leader of a country is saying racist things, even if we detest that way of being, it can even affect us subconsciously. And so it's a little bit like when you have a bully in the schoolyard, you can't just say, don't act like the bully, you need a different role model. And so, if we have leaders who don't represent our values, if we spend our whole time saying that is the bad behavior, we're only talking about the bad behavior. If you want someone to act differently, you need to show them act like that instead. So just as a child might need a role model, our society needs those good examples of how things can be. And basically my experience from spending a lot of my career, attacking the people that I don't like their behavior, I'm finding it's more effective to say, why can't we be more like, say, Jacinta Ardern rather than Donald Trump, for example?
Okay, May?
Of course, Thomas, I really do get you, I myself, I used to always.
Okay, we seem to have connectivity issues with May.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sige. So we seem to have some connectivity issues, May. We can maybe go back to you later, if that's okay with you. Okay, all right. We seem to have lost her. But anyway, are there Roby, maybe you want to add a little bit about, because you mentioned earlier the role of journalists also. The role of journalists isn't so much parang pushing hope. And part of that also, it seems like, especially when it comes to the kind of journalism that we look up to, a lot of it has to do with, investigative stuff. A lot of it has to do with, in a way, exposing parang truth to power, exposing the devil and all of that stuff. How do we balance that? How do we do that balancing act of the need for criticality, the need for the truth, but also not in a way that, to Thomas's point, plays into the narrative of the world is really bad?
Yeah. No, I think a couple of big forces that influence editorial decisions and editorial decision making every single day, right? And for that matter, now in the digital world, every single minute. One is the need to be relevant, and you cannot just be speaking your mind, and you cannot pretend that you don't care about the audience. So you have to be relevant to the audience. And that's why, as I said, empathy is certainly a virtue, as Thomas pointed out. because it guides you in understanding. And the second thing is you need your audience. And there is no one size fits all. At the same time, even within an audience, people are people. They need their stories that keep them up, that make them happy. At the same time, they need their stories that make them feel attached and connected with other people who are quite frankly not as happy as them, who are more vulnerable, who have issues. And then they need their stories that really take it beyond themselves, that make them part of a larger community. I think what May is saying is that we cannot pretend that we can live off of hope. As much as hopeful stories, such as what the mayor of Tabaco shared, does go viral rather organically. We like to share that, and even media organizations will compete for that story. But part of what makes us human as well is, as everything we've said, the cynicism, the skepticism, the ability to criticize, and so on. And I think we also have to take into context that when people are critical and when they are cynical, they are also coming from a standpoint of hope. They're critical and cynical because they want to see something better. They're critical and cynical because they know that there are better options out there. I think every time you try to box yourself in, or the audience, or even your message and your content into, oh, we are different from other organizations or other content developers because we are this, I think it makes your job that much harder, and you close yourself off, and the tendency is actually there could be a tendency to make you irrelevant to a very wide audience.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. Do we still have May Paner on the line? May, you still there? We have about 30 seconds left. May?
I'm just to what Robbie is, because I truly believe that when you want to connect to your audience, it is truly very important to know where they are coming from. Because that place of vulnerability is a very important point for us when we make our connections to the people we want to reach out.
Thank you so much. Thank you, May. So now we'll call on Veronica Oy, our second discussant, to maybe react or ask a question. Veronica.
Hello, good afternoon. Before I ask, there's only one question I have for the panelists, actually. But before I ask that question, I just want to react to everything that's been said. I'd like to speak as what I'd like to call myself as a storyteller than a political communications person. So, and I'd like to backtrack a little when we talk about crisis, because the crisis, for instance, in the Philippines, really exploded when the new administration came in. And there was really a lot of discussion after that on how to counter it, because the president won on the emotion of anger and hate. And so really, it is logical that you fight it with the opposite of it, which is love and hope. But it's really very difficult. I understand where May is coming from when she says that there has to be a balance, because while we cannot ignore what's being done, there's really a conscious effort from the part of those who are communicating hate and anger. This is how they divide. This is how they are able to amass more power and do whatever they want. This is how they do it. This is and you cannot not react to it without letting them get away with it. But at the same time, I believe also, and I agree that there should be there should hope and love. Love is my love is the answer, as they say. So love has been my what do you call this? My slogan. And if you and for and throughout history, the greatest teachers, the greatest stories are all about love. The greatest teachers, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, all taught love. But also coming from the perspective of a journalist, conflict is also what drives storytelling. So you cannot ignore the conflicts that are also being uh, perpetrated or being promoted actually by the promoters of hate. Uh, so that's my reaction. Also, the other reaction is this crisis and the other crisis and the future crisis that we're going to face are all a reflection of how we are treating each other and the disconnections that have happened or are being uh, um, engendered by the hate propaganda. Um, so yeah, but also crises are opportunities. So this is also is an opportunity to drive our own messages and our own agenda, if you will. Um, Yun. So uh, two things also. No, the other one is on empathy. If you're clear about who you're talking to, uh, you have to speak their language. Just like these are the lessons that you learn from the president. He knows how to speak the language of his audience. He knows how to be one of them. Yeah. So there. But so my question is, how how do you do this? How do you spread hope given that there's an active there's an active uh, uh, there's an active uh, what do you call that? Active people who are promoting this. So how do you do that? Number one, when you have them, and also that the medium in which they're promoting it or propagating it is through a medium that they've already dominated and that they have gamed. So there.
Okay, maybe we start with Thomas. Thomas, I'm very interested in what Veronica also said. Not letting people get away with bad things, basically. How do we balance that with hope-based communication? When we do hope-based communication, will the bad guys get away with the bad things that they've done?
Yeah, great point. I mean, we, again, thinking from the perspective of our audience, usually the bad guys get away with it by making people see that the things they're doing are necessary and maybe not so bad. So how do we make sure people see something as bad? Well, you have to define what's good, right? Because something only seems bad in the context of being good. And so the point, to be really clear, is it's at 100% in absolutely no way does this involve ignoring or not talking about the problems, which again is basically what I spent my whole career doing in human rights. It's about, if we actually want to fix those problems, we have to replace them with something else. And a lot of the time, actually, the thing that we want to replace them with, the good things, are not yet popular or supported. And again, the bad guys have actually made us believe that they're not possible. So climate change, for example, we spend a lot of times, being really angry about climate change, but to fix it, we all need to massively change our culture. We need to not fly so much anymore. To bring about those changes, people really need to believe they're possible. And so I think the really important point, though, is, how do we promote hope when they're so good at spreading anger and hatred? It's a little bit almost like, the brain actually, gets fed with these different hormones. It's like, it's easy to be hooked on smoking or alcohol. It's wired in our brain. The same goes for anger and hate. And then, actually running gives us, or, positive, healthy activities give us also those positive boosts in our brain. And so it's basically, the philosopher Martin Nussbaum calls it the practice of hope. It's just like empathy as well. It's a muscle that we have to train and practice. And so actually, that's why I think it's so important that we ourselves don't respond to hate and anger with hate and anger. Because if you respond to fire with fire, you burn everything down. And if we want a world built with empathy, we have to practice that empathy. And it's a hard thing for us to do. I'm a Jew who lives in Germany. How do we practice empathy for the people who harm us? For the people who do wrong? That's potentially one of the starting point. I think it was a great point to reference, great people in past, like, Buddha, and so many of those teachings were about actually practicing empathy. It's easy to practice empathy to the people who we like. It's harder to practice it to people we disagree with. But the key thing that JustLabs has said is that if the tools of populists and divisive leaders are crisis and conflict and anger, we need a different set of tools that we have to almost build a separate house rather than try and tear theirs down. And that's something that we build on cooperation, community, and culture. And I think that's where, storytelling, journalism, but also the arts play a really important role in just building something different.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm gonna go to Roby and ask, because Veronica mentioned, how active forces are using new media or platforms to be able to push their agenda. So Roby, you've been in the media for a while, but also you understand both traditional media and new media, having started a podcast company. I'm very interested in what you think about that.
Well, first off, when Onik talks about social media in particular being gamed, I fully agree that you could feel resources way beyond what's within our resources, what's within our fingertips. We are overwhelmed we imagine the troll armies. They must be hundreds. We imagine the funds to boost these armies, their posts and so on. That war chest must be much bigger than what is at disposal from your personal credit card and so on. So you will always lose. My concern is that my first question, however, is because it is gamed and because it is such a new game, I really don't know how sustainable that is. And I know it has a moment right now. I know that this gaming of social media and the troll armies and the gaming of algorithms, they're having a moment right now. And that moment makes for dark days. And we're going through those dark days right now. I just don't know how sustainable that is, given the amount of attention that there is already. My other concern is what was alluded to earlier, which is fighting fire with fire. When there was a social media campaign to have Mocha Uson barred from Twitter, and it turned out to be quite successful, there was really a lot of hand-wringing on the part of journalists and free expression advocates on, should we do this? Is this something to encourage? On the one hand, you look at this one character representing an entire machinery, and you make her stand in and proxy and iconic for, as you said, people on that side gaming the system, and that's them. On the other hand, when you play into that game of using the very algorithms and mechanisms that we are protesting against Facebook and Twitter, precisely because it is so easy to game, then you're not just fighting fire with fire, you're playing with knives. And does it really further your cause? Did it really make a game when all you did was just say, I can play that game too? I think what's important in trying to communicate to people hope-based values and communications for particular values that we want to put forward is it's hard to do. But you do have to communicate that this is not about personalities and this is not about certain people. And for that matter, it's not about this particular moment. It is about certain values that we're trying to uphold. Transparency, accountability, honesty, meritocracies, and transparency and so on and so forth. I think and the only unfortunate thing about that is that we know that that's a much harder campaign, and it's for the long term, and it's not something that's actually within our control just as storytellers or just as media. When we start talking about, it's really about building the values, building resilient people, resilient in information, not just in terms of disasters, but this is resilient in terms of knowing what's fake news, what's commentary, and so on. It takes everything. It takes families. It takes a long-term investment in education. It takes a long-term investment in media and information literacy, and so on. And I think you have to embrace that very basic premise that there's no quick fix here. In the meantime, I personally just hope that while there is no quick fix here, this is just a quick moment. It is a moment in time. We're going through this dark period. The good news, hopefully, is that for every dark period we've entered in human history, we have always emerged as a global community, as nations, and learned our lessons from there. And we've tried to put in place not just the technological, but also the social controls that allow us to behave properly.
Thank you, Robbie. That's a very good point that you made about this, there not being a quick fix, it being for the long haul. And I suppose maybe that's why, I assume that's why we will need hope, because it's not easy to keep fighting when, you know, it's really long term. It's not a quick thing. Okay, before we move on to our next discussant, Mayor Krisel Lagman-Luistro is actually here. So we'll say hi. Hi, Mayor Krisel. Mayor Krisel.
Hi.
Hello, hi. We hope that you're okay there. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making time. Just one quick question for you. Earlier, before we pad to you, we were asking the question of how do you balance, you know, the need for criticality, the need to tell people the truth, and also hope-based communication. And we would suppose, because you're a local leader and you're on the ground and you're dealing with this crisis on the ground, you have firsthand experience of this. How do you balance that? You need to tell people that this is a bad thing, but you also need to give people hope. Where does the balance come to play?
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud
Hello?
and clear. Yes, loud and
Yes.
clear.
Yes. Hi. I can't go back to Zoom. But anyway, since you can hear me, yes, it's actually just, I think first and foremost, you have to give them the facts. You have to give them the correct facts. You know, like for instance, you just tell them that this is how it is spread. These are the symptoms, and then they would ask, okay, so what do I do about this? So, and then you give them hope that, hey, you can do something about it, because if you don't move, then the virus will not move. So that's how we contain the virus. So the stay home campaign really, we were able to push the stay home campaign by saying, if you don't move, then the virus will not spread, because human beings spread the virus. So I guess telling them straight the facts, and then giving them, making them realize that yes, this is the problem, but you are part of the solution, and this is what you can do. You know, it gives them hope, and it also is good for leaders, because we don't have to be burdened with doing everything. Now we have the people to support us.
Thank you so much for that, Mayor Krisel. Now we'll move on to our next discussant, Edna Aquino. Edna.
Hi.
Hi,
Is it
Edna.
my turn?
Yes,
Is it
we
my
can
turn
see
now?
you. Yeah, it's your turn.
Okay, hi. Hello. It's almost good evening to everyone, and thank you so much to Vice Al for inviting me and giving me the space to share my thoughts on hope-based communication. I think I would like to open my my sharing with a reaction to Thomas regarding hope-based communication. It's really, I'm not even sure if it's a question or a comment, but Thomas, you and I came from the same context. I was with Amnesty International at the IS for 16 years. So having spent that long time in an organization that really thrived a lot on sending the message of hope, I don't think that I am short of hope. I still have that in me, but I think that having been back to Asia for the past almost 2 decades now, I think that we cannot, there are limitations in terms of talking about hope or virtues like hope in isolation of politics. And I think that that's what I'm missing when I was reading your webpage, your website, and listening to your uh, uh, conversation,
Podcast.
the podcast. I think that's what I've been missing. I have this nagging feeling that we can spread the message of hope. We can change. We can infuse more values, positive values, but we're not talking about politics. And I'm glad that Roby and Veronica touched on that, because for me, I think hope may be meaningful if we also teach people to look at power. And as a feminist, I make it an integral part of my human rights advocacy that I would always impart this analytical framework to women, especially in the community, to be able to analyze power in their context. So when we speak of hope, it is so, the question that we need to always reflect upon is who's speaking and what interests are behind those messages of hope. For instance, I'll give you an example. The popular slogan now, the slogan that's being used by the government right now in the campaign on the COVID-19 is "We heal as one." And that is a very powerful narrative. And they have been very good in sending and bringing that message across. We heal as one. But then it takes a political lenses to be able to then analyze that this is the most, the program on COVID-19 is so exclusive. It does not take into account, it's anti-poor in fact, and it looks at poor as subjects of charity. Give them dole-outs, and that will be it. But when it comes to minor offenses like violating the quarantine rules, the self-distancing rules, during the early stage of the lockdown, you know, these people from the urban poor got a lot of beatings. And there are some communities who had volunteered to set up food kitchens for the neighborhood, and they also got arrested and detained. So I think that we have to bring in, I don't have a problem with the message of hope or hope-based communication, but I think that it cannot be in isolation of politics. So that's one. Then I would like to also share the story of the survey that was made a few weeks ago regarding people's attitude to the COVID-19. And one of the questions that were asked was that, are you willing to forego your human rights to be able to protect yourself? And I was so astounded with the percentage of people saying yes, they're willing to compromise their rights. More than 80% said so. And so I was very intrigued. In so many ways, I was like questioning. I started having doubts. How was the question posed? How was it recorded? How was it documented? And so to further my probing of the figures behind the more than 80% who said that yes, they're willing to compromise on their rights. I, together with Oya and Mika, we're part of a project that's currently doing focus group discussions in the communities to further probe on people's attitudes to human rights and COVID-19. And I was surprised that many of the respondents to the question were saying, yeah, they understand rights, they understand social solidarity, but they would rather have, they're also saying that this is not the right time to criticize the government. That can be done later. But when asked a question in terms of what are your rights, what rights are most important to you, and they would unanimously say it's the freedom of expression. So what you see here is a contradiction that on the other hand, they're saying they're very forgiving, they're very patient towards the government, because right now for them, what is more important is for all of us to be able to be secured, be protected. But on the other hand, they have no doubts that it's the freedom of expression which they will not compromise. So that's and that drives home the point here that I think we have to be very careful in terms of how we configure images of people's attitude to human rights, and for that matter, people's attitude to empathy and social solidarity. Because I think there's a lot that language and interaction can tell us more than just saying, than just making this judgment that we have not been effective, or we have not been able to make the change that we promised people for the past decades or so as a human rights enterprise. So that's one. The other thing that I would like to share here is about what are the practical things that we can do to be able to make hope-based communication be more real. For me, it's about language. I agree with Veronica that I think I will not problematize the use of the word crisis as Thomas did. I think what's more important for me, what's more telling for me is the masculinity in the use of the language. So for instance, we had war against drugs. This government has a tendency to package their agenda, which is always anti-poor, as a war. So they had this war against drugs, and now it's the war against coronavirus. It's the masculinization of language that for me is more dangerous than the word crisis itself, because I think, as Veronica said, crisis or conflict has.
Hello, Edna. Edna, I think you went on mute. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where did I stop?
Just a couple of seconds, so you can continue.
Okay. So there's the masculinization, and the second thing is about storytelling. Thomas talked a lot about storytelling, but again, I would bring in some power dimension into this. I think that we have no problem about storytelling. I totally agree that people would love to hear stories that give them hope, that empower them into action. But I think we also have to be wary about the co-optation of those stories. It is so easy, especially with the mass media nowadays, to pick up stories that represent the audience interest and package it as if it is the government's narrative. I think Mocha Uson is a very good representation of that co-optation of stories, as she would represent herself as the champion of OFWs, or migrant workers. And then there's also the question of hope-based communication is really very much dependent on trust. And I think that, as I mentioned earlier about the survey that had taken place and what I have found out in some of the focus group discussion, you have suddenly you have people who are willing to be obedient to the government and are willing to postpone or compromise on their rights. But at the same time, you know, as Roby Alampay had cited some examples, they can also, thanks to social media, they are also very articulate about the shortcomings of the government. Roby cited 2 examples, and there are more. I've collected some more where, because of anger, because of frustrations, and because of expectations of what the government can do, we are able to effect changes with such speed because of the social media. What else? I think for human rights advocates, this has been my long-standing advocacy. I think human rights activists or advocates have to get out of the narrow frame of human rights. And Thomas, you and I have seen this during our times at Amnesty International, when the legal framework would dominate the discourse on human rights, and we have sidelined the stories of the victims and the survivors, or we tend to sideline the stories of the victims and survivors. But I think more than that, there is the question also of we have to really navigate and cross the bridge between that divide between civil political rights and socioeconomic rights. And at the moment, especially in the context of the COVID-19, it is extremely challenging to be talking about civil political rights when people are much more overwhelmed by the day-to-day need to survive the virus. I think so.
Yeah, thank you, Edna. Very quickly, Thomas, I'll ask you maybe to react to that. So just very quickly, maybe react to Edna's reaction to your presentation.
I really agree and love everything Edna said. I couldn't agree more. I think the thing with politics is and particularly in terms of, you know, looking at power relations, is we have to change politics, not act within it. I remember in university, a professor told me, if you are anti-colonial, are you accepting that colonialism is there? Because you're defining yourself by what you're against. And I think the challenge with things like bringing feminism and, you know, other power structures, it's about actually, you know, not just playing by sort of the existing power structures games, but creating something different. And that's where I think, again, the idea of hope comes into it, because again, it's less hope about being optimistic about the present. It's about having belief in a bold vision of something different, you know, so that our organizations can be run on feminist principles, rather than say just having women in a position of power, but an organization that's still run in a masculine way. The point on the language of war is really crucial. I think we accept right now that politics is about tough men playing war games, and actually we need to redefine politics in more feminist and in other terms, for example, bringing care into it. But I think what we need to do that is that it's built on our vision and our beliefs. And I think what we often miss there is that picture of what does that look like? What is that alternative way of being? And I think 100% is what's really important, what Edna said, is that it's about those visions are painted by different people who are currently the dominant voices in our societies, from Indigenous people, from women, but that they get heard by speaking the truth of who they are, not conforming to what, you know, is expected right now.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. We will need to go to Michelle Pascual, our last discussant. Michelle?
Hi, everyone. Really just fascinating discussion that's been going on. And I know I have a couple of minutes left, but a couple of observations. I work with an organization that uses a lot of behavioral science and behavioral insights to think about how people can change their behaviors, or, you know, create nudges for climate change and conservation and many of these other things. And I think the first statement I want to make is hope influences human behavior. And I think it's important to be able to make that, to establish that. And it's so easy to kind of downplay hope, because when you think about hope, you know, it almost feels like a unicorn, fluffy clouds and lollipops and things like that. And, you know, I saw this really lovely definition of hope in a medical journal, and it says it's actually goal-directed thinking, right? Hope is and this resonates with me because I remember really clearly, I forget which disaster this happened, but Anderson Cooper, an anchor for CNN, he said, hope is not a plan, right? And that struck me now. I'm listening to Roby and to Thomas and to all of the other speakers, including Mayor Krisel, that hope, in fact, is a plan, right? If we look at the definition of hope being being goal-directed thinking, it's a cognitive process, right? We're not saying that empathy and feeling and emotion is not part of it, but if you hope to get somewhere, you start to lay out a plan for it, right? And so I think that's one of the things I want to be able to establish right then and there. But I guess I'm going to go straight to my question because, you know, the team and I, and when I say the team and I, Mika, Joza, and Oya, even before, we worked on a human rights campaign and we called it Tokayo. And in Filipino, that means sharing the same name as a person. And so we basically said, we tried to draw an empathy between a human rights victim and someone who shares your name, right? And show that you share the same human rights. Now, establishing that hope is in fact a plan, it's a cognitive process, it's a goal-directed way of thinking. How do you start to operationalize hope, right? How do you, in comms, or whether it's in policymaking or it's in creating an enabling environment for hope, how do you begin to operationalize that?
Okay, Thomas?
Oh, thanks, Michelle. That's such a great question and so interesting. I think we should, I want to hear more from you, really, but I think it goes back a little bit to the point we were discussing earlier around the media, you know, that sense that it's kind of rigged against us in social media. And, you know, how do you respond to a troll army? In Sweden, they responded to a troll army by creating a love army. And basically they were just mobilizing people. Whenever someone would come and start having negative comments, they would mobilize and start putting positive, supportive comments. And I think that's part of it. And I associate a lot, like Robbie was saying, I think associated a lot with creating empathy. And I basically had to ask myself, like, what is the end goal of human rights actually? But like Edna was saying, the legal framework is important, but it's a means to an end. What is that end? And I'm still working on it, but I think it's about more empathy for each other, exactly like that campaign. It's about the human part, not the rights part. It's about that we all see each other as human. And so it's actually feels like the future of human rights work is about creating activities and creating moments that we can engage in, where we see each other as human. And the origin of Amnesty International, where Edna and I used to work, was people sitting and writing letters to other people just because they were human. And so I feel it is a whole body of work there where we need to start looking at the simple activities, like what does it look like to do human rights? And I think instead of, say, being on the street protesting, maybe the future is less demonstrations, more dinners. Maybe it's about having, you know, interactions with people who are different from you. But so I feel it goes back a little bit to, like, how do we respond to power that wants us to be a certain way? I think it's interesting to look, for example, in the Eastern Europe resisting communism, their way of resistance was to have their own space. So it's a little bit like civil society, really. It was about, you know, the communist government wants to control us. We're going to have punk rock parties in the basement. And that's a space where we can be ourselves. So I feel like it's about basically, you know, creating our own way of being, our own activities. And on a simple level, again, it comes back to, I think it can be quite simple things in the sphere of culture and community. Just a simple act maybe of having dinner with some refugees is already building that hope and empathy.
Okay, I want to turn to Robbie because PumaPodcast has been producing a lot of COVID-related content. You have COVID diaries, you have meditation, you've been covering, even on the scientific level, on the political level, you've been covering a lot of topics when it comes to this. To Michelle's question, how do you operationalize hope? How does that come into play when you do the editorial for the PumaPodcast?
Well, yeah, I've been thinking about hope this entire conversation. And I think my difficulty with it, as I said from the start, and as I'm coming to it now towards the end, is that I see hope of course, is a good thing. But at the end of this conversation, I think my takeaway is that hope is a value, hope is a virtue, but it's not my message. And I think that as a storyteller and as a journalist, that's where I would say I have my difficulty. As a content developer, particularly thinking of journalism as my core value, hope is not what I'm peddling. Hope is what keeps me going. As Edna said, you cannot be an activist in the human rights field in the Philippines of all places and be criticizing government and shouting all of these slogans and being rabidly critical of what needs to be criticized and rabid for the things that need to be upheld. You cannot be in that field without being an optimist, right? And yet government casts you as a pessimist. And people say, aren't you tired of just seeing the negative in society? And aren't you tired of just talking about deaths and torture and so on? But I think Edna's point precisely is no. Hope is the value that underpins everything that I'm doing. I am dreaming of a better future. I've seen better societies. I've seen better governments. I've seen other leaders. There are models that I want. And that's why I'm criticizing. So that's how I would reconcile the two things. I see hope as a value and as a virtue, but it's not necessarily the message that I think I should be peddling every single day.
Okay, Thomas, would you like to react to that?
Oh, it's so hard. I mean, there's been such wonderful things said. I mean, I think really, when I was just hearing Michelle talk, it just reminded me of what I just thinking, how I define hope. Yeah, I try to define hope as a smart strategy for change. And I think I'd agree with Robbie. It's not even necessarily the end in itself, but it's a strategy. It's both how we need people to feel. I feel for me, I think the end goal, when I try and ask what it's all about, I think it's empathy and human rights as seeing other people as human. And so I have to say, I'm not a hopeful person myself. I often say I'm hopeful for my work, but I'm a pessimist in my spare time. I just believe, I think like this idea, it's the plan, it's the road, it's just a strategy for, I think, achieving what many of us want, is that and what we've been reminded of in this moment is that we're all human and we need to treat each other that way.
Right. So we go back to the science.
If I could just add,
Sure.
Mika, I mean, I thought of something. As an example of something that if you do not draw the line between your value and your strategy, and for that matter, your objective, another word that is a value and is a virtue, that became the strategy and became the be all and end all, and people got sick of it immediately, is resilience, right? There was a time when the message of the Filipino is resilient was something that gave all of us hope and a sense of community and a sense of pride. 4 typhoons later, we're all sick of it. Everybody says, that's enough of resilience. I mean, it's damaging to our culture. It's making us complacent. We're letting government off the hook by saying it's okay to be incompetent because the individuals are resilient anyway. And that's an example of a value that was improperly framed as the message, right? And is improperly framed as the product itself. And I think it's the same thing with hope. It's something that we should cling to, that should be in us, and it will shine through. I mean, the spirit of shine, and it will sustain us. It sustains us in the human rights field. It sustains us in journalism. It sustains us in our different advocacies, notwithstanding all of the difficulties. But we realize that the product that has to come out at the other end has to be very, very tangible and very, very grounded on the realities of our people.
Right. Okay, thank you so much for that, Robbie. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. So I'm looking at the questions we have now. Okay, we have a question that's been selected for me from Nash Theismans. She was actually a guest on our podcast, episode 2. So this is kind of like everyone's mutual admiration here. So Nash asks, hey everyone, can I just ask about the political relevance of hope Is there a way to crowdsource hope rather than expect this to come from our communicators whose task must also include listening, not just advocating? Also, apart from the language of crisis, can hope-based communications also be informed by a language of care rather than war? And finally, how do we, in this current context, use the technology to replicate spontaneous exchanges that make our narratives come alive and ferment political movement? Some of these things have been touched upon by Edna, but if you have additional thoughts, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, the answer in general is yes. I love all those points. I think it's a really important point, that thing of listening. But also, I think as communicators, actually, our job above all is just, it's about which stories we elevate. I think that the same goes for journalism. You know, like there's quite a few people in the human rights field to say we do truth, but I think we, you know, if we look at power relations, we have to accept we're also using our power when we decide which truth we're pushing forward. You know, whose story are we telling? And so, you know, we choose to show sort of the negative story, but we can also show, you know, the things that are happening in society. So I think as communicators, it's more about trying to actually hand over more power. And what's really exciting on the technology front is that we can do that. That, you know, with social media, we can allow people who are currently less powerful, marginalized voices, and actually let them speak for themselves. And I think even like I mean, Nike, for example, do this in the realm of sports, where, you know, instead of saying a certain stereotype is bad, let people from a certain group be themselves, and actually don't sort of attack a stereotype, just show a completely different way of thinking about a group of people. And I think with technology, we need to be better at, when we find those stories where people are speaking their own truth, you know, like showing, say, a certain group of people in a different light, we then have to actually, for example, run social media ads and, you know, really push out those stories to make sure that they get seen. And I think the point of care in war is crucial. So the biggest thinker on framing and messaging and narrative is called George Lakoff. And he tells us that when we make the case for what we want to see, we shouldn't use the worldview, the way of thinking, the morals of our opponents. Sometimes we think that's a good way to convince them. You know, you think that, security is important, but let me tell you what will really give us security. Instead, George Lakoff says we build on our own worldview, which is primarily built on care, empathy, and, these are his words, hope. And so I think care actually, as the sort of grounding value of our politics, is really a way to practice hope. And that's the thing I think we need to most learn from this moment. But above all, we've talked about politics and hope. Well, I can't do that without mentioning probably my hero, which is Barack Obama. And if you need proof that you can build politics on hope, all we need to do is remember, yes, we can, which I find quite therapeutic at the moment in this Trump era. Whenever I hear something terrible of Trump, I go back and just watch an old Obama clip.
Thank you, Thomas. Robbie, I want to just ask you about that. The conversation on storytelling keeps coming up, right? And you guys are very good at telling different kinds of stories from different worldviews and different perspectives on PumaPodcast. When you really, especially for COVID Diaries, it's a way. It's kind of like a platform, a way for us to empathize. How does that kind of look like within your editorial team, and also the feedback you've been getting from these stories?
Well, let me tell you quite quickly, one of the ironic things of this quarantine and COVID is that we've become much more productive. And our audience actually grew by 400% because of COVID Diaries. So that's an example of a crowdsourced stories of hope, and certainly of empathy. Not everything was actually hopeful. There were a lot of very tragic stories there, but certainly hearing people speaking in very raw, with no video, it really creates a lot of empathy and so on. But we'll tell you the process we're going through right now. And honestly, we are about to close our chapter on COVID Diaries. And we've started up another series now of podcasts called A Better Normal, where we invite conversations with people who have basically are saying, look, let's take use of this crisis to throw away some bad things. And when we come back, let's not come back to a new normal. I have an idea for a better normal. But the thinking there is that it's the same thing. You have to empathize with your audience. What are they feeling right now? And as I said from the start, as an editor, I do feel that people are still concerned, of course, about their health and their safety. But there is a collective narrative and certainly a collective restlessness with regards to, I need to get back to work. If I go back to work, what will traffic look like? What will my office look like? What will malls look like? Can I still visit my mom? What will traveling to the provinces be like? What will schooling for my kids be like? So that's why, and that's the dilemma every single day of editors and journalists, because the narrative does change precisely because the emotions of people from whom you want to crowdsource a movement are also changing. At the start before quarantine, we were about to launch a podcast, an investigative podcast series, our first one, a 6-parter called Tukhang sa Tukhang. So it was about the war on drugs. It was a 3-year retrospective on how is it going now. Not overly critical, but rather really trying to talk to the police. How are the police doing now? How is the artist community doing now? How are the musicians doing? The drug addicts, of course, the rehab centers, people who lost loved ones. So, tukhang sa tukhang, kumusta sa nangungumusta, di ba? That's what tukhang meant. But it was a check-in on tukhang. And then COVID happened. And immediately, we had to make a decision that, well, I'm not going to release that now. It's totally irrelevant. As big a problem as a drug war was and continues to be and will be once we get back to some kind of normal, the past 3 months was not the time to talk about it. And so I think the main takeaway is you have to be in touch and you have to be confident that you have a pulse on where people are right now. And I think where people are right now is this ambivalence towards, I need to get back out into the real world. I'm totally petrified about what that real world is going to look like once I'm out there.
Thank you, Robbie. We're really about to end, but I'll just give one more to Thomas as kind of like a parting shot. Thomas, very quickly.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I guess the practical note I'd leave you with, if you want to practice hope and also try and change narratives, at JustLabs we wrote this report which is called "Be the Narrative," and it's based again on Barack Obama. His message was you have to sort of your campaign is the message, and his campaign was about change. And so if you want to change the narrative, you have to be the narrative. So think of the actions you're doing yourself. And we can all start in our own lives by practicing both the hope and the empathy that we want to see.
Thank you, Thomas. All right, that wraps up our discussion. For those who wish to continue the conversation, because we know this is not the end, please join our Facebook group called Communication for Social Change, PH. You can also look at it on our page, Wise Owl PH. To close this session, I hand you over to my co-host, Joza. Joza?
Hi, thank you, Mika. Before we end, we just want to encourage everyone to please answer our event survey. Magpa-pop up siya sa screens nyo after the session ends. Quick lang yon. We just really want to get your feedback on our first webinar. We want to thank you. Thank the guest discussants. That's Veronica Uy, May Paner, Edna Aquino, and Michelle Pascual. We want to thank then our panelists. So that's Thomas Coombes, Roby Alampay, and Mayor Krisel, Lagman-Luistro. This webinar will not be possible without our co-presenters, JustLabs, PumaPodcast, and OMCT. Learn more about them from their websites, their social media pages, and podcast channels. Again, we've recorded this webinar, so we'll be uploading the video on Facebook and YouTube. An edited version then will be uploaded on our podcast, Give A Hoot, on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Anchor, and YouTube. So please stay tuned. And salamat for being here with us. Remember your voice and give a hoot.